And we are back still with Chapter 2, and we are talking about diagnosis and eligibility right now. So let's talk about pre-referral strategies and when they're successful versus unsuccessful. If the pre-referral strategies that you've implemented are successful, great. The student remains in general education and receives the needed help and attention that they need. If the pre-referral interventions were unsuccessful, the next step is to refer the student for a comprehensive diagnostic evaluation for special education services. Now, according to IDEA, either the parent or the school can initiate this request for the evaluation. Diagnosis means the process by which an individual's specific disability is identified, and there's no standard battery of tests or procedures that determine that. Depending on the disability, different individuals can make the diagnosis. Sometimes it's a doctor, sometimes it's a school psychologist, sometimes a private clinician or the education team. Diagnosis is the first step to determining whether the child is going to need special education. IDEA identifies 14 disability categories. Make sure you study those from Chapter 1. But unless the student is diagnosed with one of those 14 disabilities, the child isn't eligible to receive special education services. And remember that simply having a disability or a condition or a syndrome does not guarantee that a student will be eligible for special education services. And when we talk about eligibility for special education, we're talking about when the child becomes qualified to receive special education services, and that determination is made by the multidisciplinary team or the IEP team. Now, there are 3 requirements for a child to be eligible to receive special education services. First, there must be a diagnosis of one of the 14 disability categories under IDEA. Second, the disability has to negatively impact the child's educational performance. And third, the child must need and benefit from specially designed instruction. For example, if you've got an 8-year-old child who has a traumatic brain injury following a car accident, then we've got this process. After pre-referral strategies are implemented and there's not much success, we refer the student to special education evaluation and we do the necessary assessments. And the results of the assessments indicate that the child's abilities, like sensory, behavioral, emotional abilities, have all been significantly impacted by the brain injury, thus warranting specially designed instruction in order for the child to effectively learn in school. At that point, the child becomes eligible for special education services. Now, a child can have a disability covered under IDEA and not be eligible for special education services. For example, let's say a developmental pediatrician diagnoses a child with autism spectrum disorder. Let's say the child is also considered to be high functioning or having many skills, and the IQ is average or above average, and the student performs well academically in the gen ed setting. Even though the child has been diagnosed with autism, the child won't qualify for special education services. But in those circumstances, even though the student's not eligible for special education services, the child might be eligible for accommodations under Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. These are called Section 504 plans. And in this case, a Section 504 plan can be developed to provide any needed additional accommodations because specially designed instruction and special education services aren't needed. So let's talk about the relationship between assessment and instruction. First of all, there are several instructional matters. Once screening, diagnosis, and eligibility have been discussed, the IEP team moves on to making instructional decisions that are based on the results of the assessments and the characteristics of the disabilities or disability that has been identified. We've got considerations like educational setting in which the child's going to be educated, what's the duration and frequency of a particular therapy or intervention, and the degree to which the student's going to be included in the general education setting. This is all part of the planning process. And all of these instructional decisions are directly linked to the results of the comprehensive evaluation, making that relationship between assessment and instruction undisputable. Once the testing has been completed, the IEP team works together to create the best possible individualized education program, including any special ed services or related services like speech language services or transportation. All of this takes into consideration the student's personal strengths and challenges. And then once the IEP has been implemented and an adequate amount of time has happened or passed, the IEP team then revisits the goals and objectives that they have set forth for the student to determine whether the plan they created is appropriate. And then we start looking at that assessment loop. Now, the assessment loop is a cyclical process where we identify learning goals, and then we do our instruction and learning, we evaluate that instruction, and then we reteach or reinforce as needed. But at this point in the assessment loop, we've got one of two things that can happen. One, the student hasn't adequately learned the content presented, and the special education teacher has to then reteach the content using new or more effective strategies, or the student does master the content and they are reinforced for a job well done. If the latter is the case, the assessment loop has been completed and then it starts again. Ultimately, the assessment loop just reinforces the idea that assessment doesn't exist by itself. It's really, it's closely tied to instruction. Now, there are two processes by which a student can be assessed in the assessment loop: formative and summative. With formative assessment, the primary goal is to observe student progress and provide regular feedback that improves teaching and student learning. It's a low-stakes assessment because it usually doesn't have a point value. Formative assessment gives us information about students who are struggling and allows us to address their problems in an expedited manner. An example would be journaling or exit tickets or voting with your thumbs, 1-minute essays, or observation. With summative assessment, we are using this to evaluate student learning. The teacher's looking for culminating progress in a high-stakes manner by comparing it against a benchmark or a standard or assigning it a point value. Summative assessments are things like chapter tests, standardized tests, portfolios, or achievement tests. A key thing that teachers have to know is that students with disabilities need adequate support in the learning process, so that when we're teaching students with disabilities, we can't simply deliver content the same way we would to students without disabilities in the general education classroom, because we know they're going to need extra assistance to reach their academic, behavioral, and social goals. And that's one of the reasons we look at a multi-tiered system of support, or MTSS. It is a broad-based approach addressing academic, social, emotional, and behavioral development of children through their school experiences. MTSS incorporates response to intervention, curriculum design, positive behavior intervention supports, which is called PBIS, teacher-learner collaboration, and homeschool collaboration and problem solving. It also requires collaboration between the general and special education teachers. So response to intervention is a multi-tiered support system that we use when identifying students with learning and behavioral needs, particularly during the early years of their education. Now, we do this so that we can, first of all, provide all students with the best opportunities to succeed in school. Second, to identify students who have learning and behavior problems. And third, to ensure that they receive appropriate instruction and related services. It is way faster than the discrepancy model. The discrepancy model takes a really long time because we have to wait for a student to fail, then we do assessment, then we determine if there's a discrepancy between the student's IQ and their achievement in any particular subject area. If there's a big enough discrepancy, then we say, oh, this student probably has a learning disability. With RTI, let us target students' learning difficulties through the use of tiered instruction. We've used this for a number of years. It's been proven to be effective, and it's quite a bit faster than the discrepancy model alone at identifying potential learning problems. It's important to know that RTI occurs in the general education setting. There are typically 3 tiers, although some districts use a 4th tier. And what happens is that a student needs to go through all 3 tiers. That is, a student is not considered for a referral for special education services until they have been unsuccessful at Tier 3. Tier 1 is high-quality instruction in the general education classrooms. All students receive Tier 1 interventions in their general education classroom. Students who are struggling there may be eligible for Tier 2 intervention. This is targeted or supplemental intervention. Students in this tier don't perform as well or perform at a lower than expected proficiency on their benchmark assessments or on their screener assessments. When they're in Tier 2, they get small group instruction, like 3 to 5 students a group, and individualized instruction as needed in the academic or social skills that they need. If a student isn't successful in Tier 2, they can be moved to Tier 3. Tier 3 is the most intense level of the RTI model. At this level, students who are performing well below their expected grade level will be here. They require intensive support and instruction. In a group for Tier 3 instruction, this is going to be 1 to 3 students maximum. Students are going to have longer sessions and they're going to meet more frequently with their instructors than they would in Tier 2. In most cases, the individuals who are responsible for intervention sessions require specialized training. This is going to be the reading specialist, a counselor, or a special education teacher. If a child is unsuccessful at Tier 3, then it is appropriate to refer that student for a comprehensive diagnostic evaluation to determine whether or not the student should receive special education services. It's important to note that a student could be in different tiers for different subjects. So as an intervention specialist, how do I ensure that students with disabilities are supported at school? I do this by regularly checking on the progress that they're making. This means instead of waiting till the end of the semester, I evaluate progress on a systematic basis. There are 2 types of progress monitoring. There's mastery measurement and curriculum measurement. With mastery measurement, I'm measuring students' skills. I am assessing the student's skills until the student demonstrates mastery of the skill. With curriculum measurements or curriculum-based measurements, this does not adhere to a curriculum sequence. I'm doing regular assessments or probes to measure all skills in the curriculum. This is a really commonly used form of progress monitoring, particularly in special education, because it allows us to incorporate many skills and we can tailor our teaching to meet the needs of our students. Progress monitoring is beneficial for the teachers because it aligns the progress with the annual goals identified on the IEP. It can and should drive instruction and provide opportunities for increased flexibility and differentiation, and these are things that are not possible when we use the mastery measurement model. Keep in mind that when we are assessing students with disabilities, some students are going to have emotional, behavioral, or social differences that impact their performance during the assessment process. Furthermore, please be aware that students with disabilities also come from varied backgrounds with diverse experiences, and because of the heterogeneity of our society, special educators have to be sure that they are accurately assessing students who are different culturally and linguistically from what's considered the norm. When we talk about students who are culturally and linguistically diverse, we're talking about students whose culture or language is different than that of the dominant culture or language in our society. So sometimes these are students who might be referred to as limited English proficient or English language learners or language minority students. There are lots of factors that contribute to overrepresentation of these particular students for disability, and this includes test bias, poverty, lack of adequate training for the educators in working with these students, and just poor general education instruction. So what we need to do is make sure that we have appropriate materials, and IDEA states that assessment and evaluation materials have to be appropriate to the individual who's taking the assessment. They cannot be racially or culturally discriminatory, and the materials need to be in the child's native language or other mode of communication. If you fail to properly assess a student who comes from a culturally or linguistically diverse background, this can result in an inaccurate test result and, more seriously, inappropriate educational placements. Now, there are ethical considerations surrounding assessment, and your textbook goes over that in detail. As special educators, we actually have our own code of ethics that we are called on to adhere to both as classroom teachers and as individuals who assess students with disabilities on a regular basis. Special education teachers are required to abide by the Council for Exceptional Children's professional ethical principles practice standards and professional policies. These standards outline the ways that certified special education teachers have to respect the diverse characteristics and needs of individuals with disabilities and their families. It's important that special education teachers are cognizant of the importance of ethics regarding assessment of students with disability, and this is particularly important when looking at students with disabilities' right to a non-discriminatory identification and evaluation under IDEA. So continue to read in the text, study the concepts, study the vocabulary, look back to those learner objectives from the beginning, and make sure that you can do that this week. If you have questions, we'll have our student hours on Tuesday, and I will be in our Collaborate classroom if you have questions.